Hey top drivers! In this second part of the video, we're wrapping up our deep dive into how dampers work. We'll pick up right where we left off with telemetry and analyze the compression and rebound speed data. This is a crucial aspect of understanding how dampers respond to different track conditions and dynamic loads during transitional phases. Negative values represent compression or bump, while the lighter colored bars indicate the time spent in the high-speed range, meaning when damper speed exceeds 25 millimeters per second. Each histogram displays the total percentage of time spent in these speed intervals for both bump and rebound, alongside the average speed. When analyzing a damper histogram, two key elements come into play: the peak and the symmetry. The central column of the histogram is called the zero node, the point where bump and rebound values separate. This parameter is a general indicator of suspension stiffness. The higher the zero node, the stiffer the suspension setup. If the zero node is particularly high and the car feels too nervous or puts excessive stress on the tires, reducing the overall stiffness could be a good solution. In a properly tuned suspension system, the bump and rebound bars should gradually decrease as they move away from the zero node. The rate at which they drop depends entirely on the stiffness of the setup. A stiff setup will result in a tall, narrow histogram, often referred to as tall and skinny. This happens because a stiff suspension moves less and requires more energy to do so, meaning the bars near the zero node will be significantly taller than those on the edges of the histogram. On the other hand, a soft setup produces a short, wide histogram known as short and fat. Here, the suspension moves more freely, spending less time in the zero node range. The central bar remains the tallest, but the surrounding bars are much higher than they would be in a stiff setup. One of the most common questions is, what's the ideal histogram shape for all four wheels of a race car? To maximize mechanical grip, the goal is to minimize load variations. In theory, this would mean achieving an even distribution between compression and rebound, with the damper spending the same amount of time in both phases and dissipating equal amounts of energy. Another crucial aspect when analyzing histograms is symmetry. A well-balanced histogram should be symmetrical around the zero node, ensuring that the damper dissipates the same amount of energy in compression and rebound. If the histogram is asymmetrical, the car may experience a phenomenon known as jacking down or jacking up. This occurs when there's an excessive imbalance between bump and rebound, referred to as bump bias or rebound bias, respectively. A bump bias causes the car to gradually lose ride height until it bottoms out on the bump stops. The on-screen image helps visualize what happens when a suspension setup has a specific bias or imbalance. A histogram skewed towards the bump side will show negative asymmetry, while positive asymmetry indicates a bias towards rebound. From a purely theoretical standpoint, according to textbook principles, the gold standard for damper histograms is achieved when all four interconnected corners of the car are perfectly balanced, not just in terms of bump and rebound values, but also in the peak heights of each histogram. However, in real-world conditions, achieving this perfect balance is nearly impossible, and chasing it at all costs could even be counterproductive. To better understand imbalance and how to correct it, let's go through a practical example. Suppose a damper moves 10 millimeters in both compression and extension. If we set one click of bump and one click of rebound, assuming equal damper forces in both directions, the damper will take 1 second to compress 10 millimeters and another second to extend 10 millimeters back to its original position. In this scenario, the total damper operation time is 2 seconds, evenly split, 50% in bump and 50% in rebound. Now let's increase the bump setting to 2 clicks while keeping rebound at 1 click. The damper still moves the same 10 millimeters in both compression and extension, but with the increased compression damping, it now takes 2 seconds to compress, while still taking only 1 second to extend. As a result, the total operation time increases to 3 seconds. 2 seconds in bump, 66.6% of the total time, and 1 second in rebound, 33.3% of the total time. This is a classic case of a bump bias, meaning the setup is unbalanced towards compression. To bring the system back to balance, there are two possible approaches. Either soften the bump damping to return to the original state, or stiffen the rebound damping until both phases take 2 seconds each, restoring the 50-50 distribution. The goal is to minimize load variations on the tires by making setup adjustments that create the most symmetrical histograms possible. Ideally, the target should be a linear distribution, forming what's known as a bell curve or Gaussian distribution. When a wheel encounters a bump on track, the damper initially experiences positive acceleration due to compression, followed by negative acceleration as it extends once the wheel clears the obstacle. To maintain balance, the positive and negative speeds should be as similar as possible in both intensity and duration. In other words, as mentioned earlier, an ideal suspension setup should dissipate equal amounts of energy in compression and extension, ensuring predictable and balanced handling characteristics for the car. Now imagine applying all of this to a full lap around a circuit, where the suspension has to absorb thousands of bumps of varying intensity. On top of that, there are low-speed movements caused by the car's inertia acting on the chassis. If the suspension is properly balanced, the resulting damper velocity histogram will be perfectly symmetrical. The second key objective is to fine-tune the suspension so that the histograms for the left and right sides of the car are as similar as possible. Achieving this often requires using asymmetric damper settings to reach an optimal balance. Analyzing histograms involves assessing how much the measured data deviates from a normal distribution and quantifying the difference between the left and right sides of the car. However, as is often the case, theory and real-world practice don't always line up perfectly. The first thing to keep in mind is that the damper velocity histogram is an analysis tool, and that's exactly how it should be used. It will never define the absolute ideal setup for a car. Instead, it provides a statistical snapshot of the suspension's behavior at a given moment. And it's not just about what the dampers are doing. The histogram's shape changes depending on adjustments to the dampers themselves, as well as to the springs and anti-roll bars. Even the circuit layout plays a major role in the telemetry data you get. Let's take a practical look at how to work with dampers in 𝗨𝗦𝗘𝗙𝗦𝗢 Ultimate and Assetto Corsa Competizione using telemetry, starting with 𝗨𝗦𝗘𝗙𝗨𝗟 Sim. For this test, we're at Zolder with the Ferrari 296 GT3, using the damper settings shown on screen and focusing only on low-speed values. After running a series of consistent laps, without overdriving, we analyze the resulting histograms. The first observation is that we fall into the short and fat category, with the zero node almost completely absorbed into the slow bump and rebound values. However, by applying a stronger data filter, we get a much clearer picture, making the histograms easier to read. Looking at the front axle, the right side histogram already has an ideal shape, with nearly identical data, meaning no further adjustments are needed there. The left side histogram, however, shows slightly higher extension values and a subtle visual imbalance towards rebound, what we'd call a rebound bias. Moving to the rear axle, this is where adjustments are most needed. The zero node is very low, indicating either an overly soft spring or dampers that aren't stiff enough. On top of that, the histogram shows higher compression values, suggesting a bump bias. To correct this, we make some targeted changes, stiffening the compression on the front left and both rear dampers, as well as increasing the rear spring stiffness by one click to rebalance the histograms. After another run, we check the updated telemetry. The rear values now show a higher zero node, though still partially absorbed into the data, and the left rear finally has a more balanced symmetry after the adjustments. However, the right rear still shows a clear bump bias. Up front, while the left side has reduced its previous imbalance, the histogram still leans slightly toward rebound. Meanwhile, the right front, which was initially perfect, now displays a bump bias and a visual shift towards extension. The overall histogram shapes are still far from ideal, so we proceed with further tweaks. Based on the new data, we decide to leave the left rear unchanged while adjusting the left front by stiffening the slow compression, the right front by increasing slow rebound stiffness, and the right rear by softening slow compression to reduce the percentage gap between values. After another session, we review the new histograms, but once again the changes don't yield exactly the expected results. While the left side now shows a certain level of symmetry, there's still a slight bump bias at the rear. The right side, however, continues to display suboptimal values in shape. In particular, the front right damper has now shifted in the opposite direction compared to its initial state, showing a pronounced imbalance towards extension. This was an effect we initially aimed for, but not to such an extreme degree. As for the adjustments made to the rear right damper, they have only mitigated the excessive compression issue without fully resolving it. Looking at the data, it's clear that in Assetto Corsa Competizione, dampers behave differently from the theoretical model discussed in the first video. This seems to be a result of how the developers have implemented damper behavior, which doesn't appear to follow a perfectly linear logic. In practice, as we've just seen, it's impossible to predict with absolute accuracy how a single click up or down will affect the car's handling and, in turn, the shape of the histogram. Another factor to consider is the type of damper used, whether 𝗨𝗏𝗡𝗨𝗟, Penske, or another brand, as each has a different range of adjustment. For instance, if a damper has a range from 0 to 12 clicks, even a single adjustment can have a noticeable impact. Conversely, with a damper that adjusts from 0 to 40 clicks, you might need to change settings by increments of 5 clicks or more to perceive a tangible difference in handling. Because of this, in Assetto Corsa Competizione, it's less useful to focus on the zero node or chase a perfectly symmetrical bell curve. Even when stiffening both the front and rear suspension to the maximum, the zero node tends to remain in the same position, suggesting it's not the primary factor to focus on. To further complicate things, GT3 cars in the sim exhibit a high sensitivity to aerodynamics, particularly in relation to ride heights and rake, difference in height between the front and rear axles. This effect appears to be even more pronounced than in their real-world counterparts. As a result, histograms in Assetto Corsa Competizione should be used primarily to identify damper imbalances, whether there's excessive compression or extension. For example, if the car feels overly reactive on turn-in and the histogram reveals a compression bias, softening the slow compression damping could help. If there's no clear imbalance in compression, then other parameters, such as lowering the rear ride height, might be the key to improving stability. When adjusting dampers in Assetto Corsa Competizione, one fundamental aspect must always be kept in mind: aerodynamics. While from a purely mechanical grip standpoint, the ideal goal would be to achieve symmetrical histograms with a near-perfect bell curve, the picture changes entirely when aerodynamic forces come into play. In high downforce cars like GT3s, prototypes, or Formula One cars, dampers don't just control bumps and transient behaviors, they're also used to manage chassis attitude. A prime example is high downforce cars that run very stiff front rebound settings to keep the nose low and optimize airflow under the floor. In this scenario, front downforce pushes the nose down, increasing rake. A high rebound stiffness helps maintain this position, improving aerodynamic efficiency. As a result, such a setup will never produce perfectly symmetrical histograms, and the resulting shape will differ significantly from a classic Gaussian curve. This is why damper tuning in Assetto Corsa Competizione must be approached dynamically, always considering its effects on the overall vehicle setup. By carefully adjusting slow compression and rebound values, we can influence how the car behaves in transient phases. However, it's crucial to remember that every change will impact ride heights and consequently rake. Higher damper values resist spring movement, increasing the speed of weight transfer. Lower damper values allow the springs to move more freely, resulting in a more gradual weight transfer. If a car suffers from understeer on corner entry, the issue lies in weight transfer, specifically the shift of load from the rear to the front under braking. To reduce understeer, we need to speed up this weight transfer, making the rear end lighter and promoting oversteer. One way to achieve this is by stiffening the rear slow rebound damping. This adjustment resists the spring's extension, effectively helping the rear unload more quickly, allowing the car to rotate better into the corner. This approach works well for a car that relies primarily on mechanical grip for performance. However, when aerodynamics come into play, the logic needs to change. In a high downforce car, reducing understeer on corner entry means shifting more load onto the front axle. To achieve this, we need to soften the rear rebound damping, allowing the spring to extend more freely under braking. This causes the rear to rise faster, reducing aerodynamic load on the underbody, making the rear less stable, and helping the car rotate more effectively. At the same time, softening front compression damping allows the nose to drop faster under braking, increasing front-end load and improving turn-in response. This is the ideal way to fine-tune slow damper values in Assetto Corsa Competizione, using subtle adjustments to refine the car's behavior in transient phases, without making drastic changes to ride heights, springs, or toe settings. While those parameters could solve a particular issue, they might also introduce new imbalances, disrupting the car's overall balance. Now let's move on to 𝗨𝗦𝗘𝗦𝗢𝗨𝗥𝗖𝗍, the new sim still in its release phase. Unlike Assetto Corsa Competizione, it runs on the 𝗨𝗥𝗢𝗘𝗦 physics engine. For this test, we chose Monza and ran an 𝗨𝗪𝒑2, despite being far more powerful and aerodynamically efficient than GT3s. 𝗨𝗪𝒑2 cars in 𝗨𝗦𝗘𝗦𝗢𝗨𝗥 are less dependent on rake to generate rotation. In fact, they tend to perform best when the floor remains as flat as possible. The first test was conducted using the default setup, with no adjustments to the suspension or dampers. After 4 laps, the histograms revealed a significant difference compared to those from Assetto Corsa Competizione. Here, the histogram shapes were much closer to what we'd expect to see in real-world telemetry. Analyzing the data, the rear was already well-balanced, while the front showed a bias towards slow rebound values on both sides. To address this, we made the following changes. Increased front slow compression damping by 3 clicks, increased rear left slow rebound damping to match. After a second run, we reviewed the telemetry. With just a few adjustments, the histograms were nearly perfectly balanced. While there was still a slight visual asymmetry between the front left and rear right rebound, the percentage values aligned, meaning there was no need to obsess over achieving a purely symmetrical shape. It's crucial to remember that there are no magic numbers for creating a perfectly balanced and fast car. The key is not just knowing how to read telemetry data, but also understanding how the car behaves on track. After every adjustment, the only real indicators of a successful setup are lap times and driving feel. In this case, the new configuration not only produced more consistent and balanced data, but also delivered a tangible performance improvement, confirming that the adjustments were effective.